So, to continue on, welcome, on behalf of the presidents of the gallery, welcome to our 22nd Street location in New York City in the second floor gallery, in the presence of British artist Anj Smith's new body of work titled Drifting Habitation. So I just want to give a little short story on how this all came together. There was a momentous day in London this spring where Anj and I met Orna. And it was one of those days you can't explain to anyone. But we were so thrilled that in planning this show and this book, we asked Orna to lead in the conversation with Anj, and Orna happily agreed. So then we moved to Paris, where the conversation happened. And I had the privilege to be in the room, and I didn't want it to end. So, of course, we invite Orna to celebrate with us in this show in leading the conversation with Anj. So, in the form of an introduction, Anj Smith, British artist who has been working with our gallery since 2005, lives and works in London. This is her first show in nearly 10 years in New York, but it's not because she's been not working, it's because Europe and England have demanded a lot of her time, with recent shows in the New Art Gallery in Walsall in the United Kingdom, the Museo Bardini in Florence, and most recently the Perimeter in London. Orna, who is a leading psychologist and psychoanalyst in New York, and as I found out, bounded by visual arts culture since a very young age, thanks to your mother, and now to your daughter.
Yes.
And many of you may know Orna because of this very popular series on Showtime called Couples Therapy. So, I'm delighted you're both here. With respect to the public speakers, please silence your phones. The discussion will go for about 45 minutes, and hopefully we will have time for questions after that. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Aileen and Anj, for inviting me into this magical world of Anj's work. It's been an incredible journey for me to keep going deeper and deeper into the work, and hopefully you'll get to enjoy some of that with Anj this afternoon. But I thought, Anj and I met, in addition to the catalog conversation, we met just to talk. And we thought that we wanted to actually kind of bring us all into this space, not denying what's going on in the world at large, but like trying to carve out a place for us within all of that. So I'm going to actually read something that I thought, this is kind of a piece of writing that I keep going back to, generated by the Plum Village, this Buddhist village that Thich Nhat Hanh belonged to, and he recently died, but they're continuing his legacy. And hopefully that will help us carve out some space. The Buddha, a peace worker amidst the violence and conflicts of his time, said that hatred cannot respond to hatred. Only love and compassion can respond to hatred. He called this an eternal truth, an eternal law. The current conflict in the Middle East is a response to a long, complex, and troubled history. It is so painful to see what is happening there, especially to civilians on both sides. We appeal to all combatants to put an immediate stop to killing and acts of violence. This is difficult, but there's no other way. There can be no solution, no end to the suffering if things continue as they are. Thich Nhat Hanh, who experienced decades of war in Vietnam and dedicated his life to peace, has said that man is not our enemy. Our true enemy is hatred, ignorance, fear, and the seed of violence deep in our consciousness. From a Buddhist perspective, the wars in the Middle East, Ukraine, and beyond are a collective manifestation of human consciousness. That is also true for psychoanalysis. Of the collective destructive energy that exists within humanity. This destructive energy is a fundamental cause of human suffering. As members of the human family, each of us has a duty to recognize suffering within us and a responsibility to transform the seed of violence into the reality of peace. We can begin by resolving daily conflicts in ourselves, our families, our relationships with friends, our societies. The whole world needs to practice being peaceful. It is always possible to live together. It is always possible to sit down and discuss reconciliation so that a solution can be found. We need a global community of individuals living in this awareness to address the world's problems and crises. At this difficult time, it is important to take root in ourselves and calm our emotions. We invite our Israeli, Palestinian, Ukrainian friends, and all who suffer in conflict zones to sit with us so that together we may cool anger and hatred, stop harmful actions, open our hearts, generate compassion, and radiate the powerful energy of peace. Our beloved Israeli and Palestinian friends urgently need the support of the international community, of each of us. They need to know that the whole world shares in their suffering and sorrow, that we send our love and pray for their safety and well-being. This is a time for the entire family, human family, to manifest our capacity for wisdom, compassion, tolerance, and peace. There is no way to peace. Peace is the way. So,
Thank you very much for reading that, Orna.
So, it's in that sense, I think we more than any time can appreciate the importance of Anj's work, art, to take us out of the constraints of slogans, ideology, language that promotes dichotomies, binaries, conflict. And I want us to follow Anj into a space of transcendence, the sublime, where things are not fixed, but take us further and further into maybe what Freud called the navel of the dream, or what Winnicott called transitional space. So that has been like my immense gratitude to you, Anj, for like taking us into this world of yours, and opening up all these like liminal spaces, which hopefully we'll talk about. So I thought kind of to invite you into the conversation by asking you about your relationship with language and the images that you're sharing with us.
You know, I knew that it was going to be amazing to have Orna here, because that's one of my favorite questions to think about in the studio. Nobody ever asks me about that. Yes, language is really important. If I had to distill this entire body of work down to one word, I think I would probably say this show is about painting. This show, or two words, this show is about language. And what's so fascinating for me about language is that it is a deeply dissatisfying way of organizing our knowledge and our experience. It doesn't really matter what our experiences might be. We can never really share that with somebody else because there's always something lost in translation. The mechanics of language are always porous somehow. And in a sense, it doesn't matter whether it's text or something that we're describing from our experience. There's always a sense that language fails us. And I think it's been very interesting to open this body of work here and to hear the response. I mean, this exhibition has only been open for a few days, but I've had a lot of people say to me that it feels much more optimistic than previous bodies of work. And I think that's because previous bodies of work are very much centered around this idea of language failing. and how isolating that is if we can't communicate our truth to each other. But actually, I feel as though what this exhibition really encapsulates is just the intention to communicate, no matter how that might fail, is so valid and so precious. And so I think that's why there's a new note of positive, optimistic, hopeful something inexplicable that's creeping into the work.
I relate to what you're saying because I find it myself every time I approach any of these paintings. I find myself, and I see other people, I've watched people kind of move into the gallery and stand in front of the paintings, and then you see people just go like, it's so inviting to like go in, and then you discover another world and another world. It's very inviting, even though sometimes when you approach it, you're like, oh my God, what's going to happen to me? And then you go in, and more happens. Do you have a feeling of what you want to invite people into?
I mean, that's such a good question. I think what I would love is if people are looking at the work and they encounter themselves. I don't think these paintings are about me. And I think as soon as they're on the wall, I would love it if you look at the work and perhaps you come to a conclusion about something in your life or some aspect of your identity that you might not have come across before. I know certainly if I look at paintings that really inspire me, and I was very lucky to see some amazing paintings from Firale yesterday in her studio, and I had this experience of just being challenged. I found the work on one level quite perplexing, and I think art should be. I found it challenging and I found it inspiring, and it made me think I need to leave my preconceptions, whatever conclusions I've thought about anything, at the door, and to come to it fresh and be open to whatever the work might be trying to tell me. And I suppose that is very much what I would love people looking at my work to feel. That's something that I aspire towards.
Yeah, it's gorgeous. Like, to just keep opening. You're looking at that. Do you want to say something about that painting?
Well, this is the first time, I mean, I've been painting for 20 years, and this is the first time that I have felt in a position to address the whole genre of the female nude. For a long time, I felt as though there is so much loaded historicity around depictions of the female body. And I just didn't feel I was in a position to sort of burrow into that rat's nest and take on something that's so layered and so problematic and toxic and complicated. And then what happened was I was painting a ceiling, a commission in London. You saw that ceiling?
I saw it, to die, to live in that room.
At the restaurant?
Yes, in Mount Street in London. And while I was painting that ceiling fresco, I was thinking very much about how it felt to inhabit a female presenting body. From the inside, I was looking a lot at Maria Lasnik and just thinking about how that felt. And after that experience, I felt as though somehow there was a coherency that was gathering in my mind. And I thought, okay, this is what I can genuinely contribute to this whole perplexing conundrum of the female nude. I can present that there are no neat conclusions. There are no definite delineations that make sense anymore. And perhaps what's interesting is to present the problem, and to present the problem in a way that opens out into more questions. And I think we live in a time where we are so keen to label everything and to nail everything down. And to me, that felt conceptually fraudulent with what I was trying to do, because I felt sometimes the act of labeling can be in itself quite reductive.
Yeah, it interpolates you immediately to like a certain place in the social order, and that's it.
Right.
You're done, and thinking stops. So I have so many things I'd like to hear you talk about in terms of the female nude and the female body in these paintings. Do you like there are different figures on these walls? Are they speaking differently? Are they trying to capture something different about the body, the female body, the different phases in your work of creating it or struggling with questions?
I mean, that's always the position that I'm creating from. It never comes from a particularly easy place. But then I think we don't live lives like that. So in a sense, that would be pointless and reductive to even try. I think what's interesting is some of these portraits do not have a figure that is coherent in them. I'm particularly thinking about this portrait here, which is on a magenta-ish, purplish background. This is a painting called CQD, which was an international distress call. It was something that predated SOS. So that's the title of that painting. And there's also a painting on the back wall called Artist's Tools. It's the second in the series of Artist Tools. And I very much see both of those paintings as portraits in just the same sense as perhaps this painting. And it's almost as though there's a general premise that is hinted at throughout the show, that perhaps some horrendous disaster has happened, some cataclysmic event, and it's not specified as to what that is, because in a sense what that is irrelevant. It could be many things. But that there's been some kind of agency that has survived, and it's an agency that is tenacious and creative and is not defeated. And whether it is somebody that is using precious objects that they have found in the environment, in the petrified environment, and rescued those as tools with which to be creative, or whether they've curated their own personal museum of treasures. What I think my intentionality behind these paintings is that you glimpse who that person is and the nature, you sort of make a portrait in your mind of who that person is from the objects that they've rescued and decided are worth rescuing. So that's where I feel as though those are portraits, but in a much more subtle way.
Wow. Love that. So maybe this is a time to take you to the place that makes me like spin the most into the work, is the way that you transition between the human, the animal, the botanical, the veins, and the ecological. Can you talk about that?
I mean, one of the things that you and I have really bonded over is our love of animals.
As in the performance piece here?
Yes, I mean, she is amazing. I think, I'm one of those people that's completely obsessed with animals and have been ever since I was a child. But I think I have used animals, in particular the vervet creature on the first painting as you come in. Unfortunately, we can't see it here. Who is sort of crawled around her neck. Yeah, with her sort of violet ombre testicles on display just behind there. And I very much see that animal as a reverberation or an echo of the central figure. And I think the animal is so interesting in that painting as a sort of touchstone for our more bestial aspects, our more unpalatable aspects of our physical self, or maybe what we bring to our relationships with other people, something that's not polite and something that we might want to disguise and hide and make palatable in order for people to desire us. So there's a sort of, the animal is, like all things in these paintings, the animal is a sort of movable sign, because also that creature is incredibly gorgeous and it's got luscious fur. And it was very much part of the premise of that painting of a doubling. So there's 2 eyes, 2 breasts, 2 testicles, there's a sort of 2 glasses, And it's about a roving sense of self, a sense of self that oscillates and refuses to settle and be defined. And that creature is very much part of that whole sensibility.
Yeah, the animals, I mean, the hair, way back.
Yes.
Hair, I mean H-A-R-E.
Oh, yeah.
And the animals seem to get like some kind of exquisite attention from you in terms of like getting into the details of, they're like jewelry, they're like, you were saying our bestial and maybe also our best selves.
Yeah.
Like there's some way that they're more alive than anything. It makes me, when you were talking about the doubling and the animal as kind of an expression of like parts of the self, it makes me think of this concept, this psychoanalytic concept of projective identification, where we parts of ourselves that it's hard for us to own, that
Yes.
we put them into others, whether it's our partner or our animal or
Yes.
like that, all the stuff that we don't want to own in ourselves, and we project them into these other creatures, and they then have to behave it. You know, I mean, I won't get into like the politics of it, but that's the way we create enemies in our minds.
Right.
Do you want to say something about the relationship between these different animals and the human figures? Do you imagine them like being one, talking?
I mean, I always
Are
think
they
it's...
loving each other? Are they disavowing each other?
Well, the work is not definitive about that, so it is up to the viewer to decide what is happening. But I was funny, I was talking this morning to my partner, and I was saying it's ironic how animals can also bring out, they can somehow articulate literally what you're just saying, the best of our most human traits. Yeah. So when I met Nico, I felt like such compassion and love emanating from her, and I feel as though animals can help us raise our game as humans. So it's a source of great fascination to me, and I always feel, and I don't know how to express this properly, but I feel when I'm looking into the eyes of a very sympathetic animal, or even a wild animal, I feel as though I see something, and there's a cognition there that we haven't really understood socially. I feel as they're so much more sophisticated cognitively than we give animals credit for. And so I suppose the animal then, in the painting, becomes a cipher for something inexplicable that is almost like a signpost to a way that we could be, that is on a higher, more evolved consciousness.
Absolutely, yes. I think your whole work is taking us there.
Oh, good.
So some of the paintings have like a human figure, animals, life, and some seem at first sight to be inanimate, ecological. Of course, then you kind of dive in and then you discover all these little treasures inside, that life is coming out of these canvases despite the apocalypse that happened. But do you want to say something about like what made you move or change from like the human to these spaces, or what's the difference for you in creating them, or like bring us into these different worlds?
Yes, absolutely. I feel as though the genres that you would normally attach to this kind of painting, landscape, still life, portraiture, it's all collapsed. So this could very much be a portrait, just a portrait of a psychology perhaps, or a mindset. And in that sense, the animals then are part of the conceptual abstraction of this painting. It's a reference to human agency. But if you notice in this particular painting behind us, there's a flying fox with a small baby attached. Yeah, just there. But they're all bleached out, and they've got ruby red eyes. And I suppose it's come from a place of speaking about trauma and survival, and that perhaps people that have had to, for whatever reason, come at life more obliquely, have not had things handed to them on a plate, have developed certain skills that are enabling their survival. I suppose that's what, in this particular painting, these creatures mean to me. But of course, once the work is on the wall, it's up to the mind of the viewer to determine what is happening.
I encourage you all to spend some time with these creatures. And does it when you're painting, does it feel different to be painting, let's say, this kind of work and that? Are you in a different state of mind? Are you?
Yes, I am actually, and it's partly to do with physicality. So I'm not a particularly physically strong individual, so I've had to train with weights in a backpack to get some of the larger works made because it's just too exhausting to stand on a stepladder for 14 hours. And then I realise now why some of those more abstract American 1950s canvases have so much machismo imbued in them. And that really comes across because I felt I got very much in touch with my own macho identity while I was painting some of the larger canvases. It's very different to sitting in the studio working on The Gift, for example, which is that very small painting at the back. That was very different psychological space. Just because the physicality involved with execution was just so completely different.
I'm shifting. A few themes that I wanted to hear you talk about, and I think it's related to what we've been saying so far about like language and not fixing meaning, and you not fixing the meaning for others. But can you talk some about the theme of veils, glasses, veils, torn materials, stitched up, torn skin, any of those like points of like access, lucidity?
Absolutely. Yes. Well, it's been very interesting since I've been in New York to encounter a particularly favourite painting of mine at the Frick. I went to the Frick collection to see the amazing Barclay L. Hendricks portraiture show, which I thoroughly recommend. And I went downstairs to see the amazing Bronzino painting of the Medici aristocrat. And I've always encountered that painting as being a very aloof, standoffish young man, very haughty. And I know there's a lot of scholarship around that as to why, because of his personal circumstances. But what really struck me as I've seen it again this time was that I felt as though there was actually no access psychologically to the eyes. And I felt as though the conclusion that drew me to was perhaps he was coming from a place of great insecurity and he was performing that identity as a self-protection. But you couldn't be sure as the viewer because there was no access to the figure. He was very elusive. And I thought that was so interesting because you're given so much information here. You're given every pubic hair on this particular figure, but you are not allowed past a certain point psychologically. If you look at her eyes, there is a refusal very much at the heart of that work. And I think that's a really important aspect of the show. I think there is a refusal. There's a refusal for meaning to settle in one particular direction, because to do so would make it complicit in the way we've always understood painting. And I don't think you can invite new voices to the table and expect them to articulate the old truths that we've always accepted. I think things are very different, and even though this language is very representational and it's oil and it's on linen, there is something deeply subversive in not allowing for a singular read of any of these works. And they just point blank refuse to cooperate with that.
Yeah. Yeah, that is the experience. It's like you don't know how deep in you're allowed. There's questions of like privacy, what's conscious, what's not, like inside, outside.
Exactly.
Translucent, like the veins are outside, they're outside the body, the veins are like connecting you to all these other things. Like, is there really a singular identity, or is it all part of a matrix of a rhizome? Any thoughts about the veins?
I mean, that might be self-portraiture. Well, I think your point about the masks is an interesting one. Because I think when we try and hide, sometimes that's more revealing than, yeah. So there's a painting at the back called Left to My Own Devices, which is a reference to an amazing song from the 1980s by the Pet Shop Boys. And she's wearing sunglasses, and she's also wearing a visor over the top. And in both of those particular cultural artifacts, there's a slippage in terms of colour, a sort of an ombre nature of both of those accessories. And it's very much about hiding, being elusive, and again, that oscillating sense of self. And those moments where we choose to reveal, and those moments where we try to conceal, and perhaps that sometimes is the same gesture. So it was about that. And then, of course, in terms of how I'm anticipating the viewer looking at things like that, it doesn't offer you the satisfactory 3-second conclusion that I think sometimes we're used to encountering in portraiture and in painting.
Yeah, it makes me think of the psychoanalytic process, that you're always up against like what people share with you and reveal, and at the same time, resistances and the ways in which the unconscious is always right one step ready to emerge and kind of, in a way, contradict everything a person actually says.
I'm always fascinated by that and how you deduce what's really happening with somebody's narrative. That's so interesting to me.
Well, it's very similar to what you're saying, which is that you can never trust a fixed interpretation. It's always some sort of on the way to the next revelation. And you know, the moment a person, in analysis, the moment a person talks with certainty about themselves, you know it's gone, it's old, it's like useless.
Oh, wow. That's so interesting.
Yeah, which I think is the feeling around your work, this refusal to settle, and always inviting into like more and further. Do you, can you talk a little bit about your process, like how you paint?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's nothing more terrifying than just the white rectangle. Just the void. It's a horrible thing to confront. So the first thing I try to do is I mix either a lime green, I love that color, that really neon green, or a pale lilac into just because I find those colors so emotionally warm and inviting. There's no signification at that point. I just rub that into the ground. Sometimes together they make it a really gorgeous brown, like a warm honey brown. Yeah, it's lovely. And then, or separately on their own. But then after that, the spell is broken because something is happening. And so then you can work into it, and then one thing leads to another, and it's amazing how that process just takes over. It's the one aspect of this that I find impossible to describe, and it's such a legitimate question, is where does it all come from? How does it happen? I can't tell. I just can't describe what that is. When it doesn't work, and I'm trying to wrestle with a painting, and it's just not happening, it is honestly the most distressing psychological space I think I've ever encountered. But then conversely, when things are just flying, it's ecstatic, and it's the highest of the highs, and you just have to battle through both to get where you need to be.
I have a little bit of that with writing. Sometimes when I'm writing, I feel like the writing suddenly locks itself and becomes like a stone that I cannot access.
Yeah.
And it's excruciating. I guess it's what people call writer's block.
Yeah.
Yeah. And when did you start painting?
I just can't remember a time when I wasn't painting. So as a child, I didn't have paints, but I was always that. I remember being in the playground at school, and I wasn't allowed to play with the Barbie playhouse, which was in operation in the playground. I think I was a very weird child, and I was never allowed to be part of the cool gang. So what I decided to do in that moment was to strip, this is probably why I wasn't allowed to play. I decided to strip the trees of their bark and to roll up the sap that I found and to make tiny little miniature animals, which I put on the walls of the playground. Whoa. And you know how mean kids are. That was me. I was never allowed to play again. But I do remember that image.
So you started creating a world.
Yeah, I think it was just part of processing the world and being quite isolated, I suppose, in terms of peers. Although I do have 4 sisters, so I always felt like I had my gang anyway, so if you don't want to hang out, that's okay.
Right. And then when did you start actually putting things on paper?
Yeah, so I started drawing very, very early on. I don't know how old I was, maybe about 5 or 6. And it always started, I know we've discussed this before, and I really wish my parents had kept these drawings. It always started with a line across the top of the page, right at the top of the page, and then there was a subterranean world that happened underneath. Mm-hmm. And it went on for years, and very dark, disturbing images with portcullises and flames, and I didn't have a television at that point, so it's rather intriguing to work out where all of that came from.
The unconscious. Yeah. The line, the stuff on top, what we're conscious of, who cares?
I mean, there was literally nothing above the line.
Yeah, right, who cares? How are we for time, Eileen?
You're doing fine.
Good.
5 minutes.
Okay. So, do you want to share with us a little bit about your background and how you found this world and why art and what has painting been for you?
Sure. So I'm very lucky in the sense that I cannot do anything else at all. So it was this or nothing.
You're a mother.
That's true. Well, that made me want to paint all the harder. Yes, I think that background-wise, I come from Cockneys on my dad's side and very broke Irish people on the other side. So I don't know how that plays into the work.
Hybridity,
and also I think if you don't come from a very comfortable background necessarily culturally, I think you get used to the idea of performing a sense of self and code switching, and I think that psychology might be visible in the work. I don't know, it's not really for me to say, but you know, my father would always dress up very smartly to go to the dentist.
Right. You have to always perform what you think you should to earn a place in society.
Exactly.
Interesting. Does that have something to do with the glasses and the? And then there's the pop objects, the lipstick.
Yes. Well, it's very interesting how the inclusion of a lipstick can be interpreted as a very frivolous moment for some people. But I personally don't think that fashion or style or any of the accoutrement that's around that are frivolous at all. In fact, it's been fascinating since I've been here. I visited Louise Bourgeois' townhouse and I saw the lipstick that she used, the last lipstick that she used, and it was really messy. She had obviously, that was so fascinating. I'm still digesting all of the implications of that. It spoke so much to her humanity and her as a woman and just her approach in general to be an elderly lady and still being incredibly stylish and performing a certain conventionality. That really surprised me. And I think when I have something like a lipstick in the work, that is very deliberate choice, and it speaks to the agency that has survived.
You know, my association to that, I mean, my mind is roaming with what you're saying, but you know, you as an artist, you invite us, you give us kind of a place to go with our minds. And one of the things that struck me, actually, in my conversations with Aileen since we met this last spring, is like, I've been thinking a lot about the gallery as the or the gallerists as the holding environment for the artist's mind. I mean, it struck me so many times, like the way you talk about Anj, and like that you see her entire life arc and you hold it in this way. And I wonder if you want to say something about the relationship, like what you need as an artist to be able to do what you're doing.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting question. I've never been asked that before. I think a lot of artists are used to being quite elbows out because it's not the easiest path to cut through the world. And I think being part of a nurturing gallery has been an enormous blessing for me, because I've just been left alone. I've been protected from nosy, distracting people. And I'm able to get on with what I feel as though my life has been dedicated to very seriously, which is making painting, not painting with a small p that is beautiful and decorative and glorified wallpaper, but painting with a capital P, which is something that I was trying to articulate earlier, something that's very challenging and that can actually be of social use because it can make us think and sharpen our critical faculties, and then when those are sharp, we're not going to be likely to be seduced by all the manipulative rhetoric that we're all deluged by. Yeah. And we can survive with much more integrity in a sort of post-truth world. So I feel as though that the function of the gallery is extremely important in facilitating that space for that to happen.
Yeah, it's all these like parallels processes that make it possible to have a new experience.
Exactly.
Yeah. Anything else you want people to be leaving with or thinking about before we open it up to the audience for questions?
All I would say is that I think each work is probably several paintings. So if you were to come in here in a very distracted mode, as we can all be, maybe you'll experience one painting. If you come in and look at a work in a place of more psychological spaciousness, I hope that with time and that emotional generosity of the viewer, more things would emerge. So I suppose that's the last thing I would like just to clarify.
I can attest to that. Yeah, so we wanted to hear questions, associations. Uma? Oh, sorry.
It'll be a brief question, and I wish I had asked this before, but what is your relationship to spirit, or how does that phrasing reverberate within your work or within your being?
Thank you, Firale, and thank you for coming. I always enjoy our conversations about painting because I feel as though you and I are really chasing down some authenticity. And when you talk about spirit, I suppose I could take that question in many different directions. But what I take in this moment with you, having visited your studio yesterday, is I feel as though what's so important is that we are trying very hard to have an experience of great integrity in what we're doing, and to use our every faculty, and to keep ourselves really sharp conceptually, aesthetically, being self-aware in our worlds and in our contexts. And so I suppose the spirit of, I don't want to say sincerity because that's such a toxic concept to some people, but the spirit of great curiosity and inquiry and bringing everything we have to what we do, that is something that I hope I share as much as is evident in your painting.
Thank you so much. This is such a treat. I have two questions that kind of sync up into one. And I'm mainly thinking about these two paintings, possibly because I'm most interested in them or they're right in front of me. But when you're talking about kind of how willing the paintings are to be engaged with or read and received, I was thinking about the kind of like detailed intricacies that you're painting and how the painting sucks you in, but kind of like through forcing the viewer to really look closely and detailed about what specific like objects and things are there rather than on an emotional level, I guess, which feels like the barrier maybe. But I was thinking about the background, which in these two feel so softly painted and so kind of like I imagine you like really smoothing them and kind of getting into them, and they feel really inviting. And so I was curious about why I imagine you start the paintings with these backgrounds, why you start them with this like really inviting touch and then add this more kind of like edgy, specific detail, more thoughtful, I guess, oriented. And then I know this is long, but the second piece of this question is about these flashes that are on top, which I'm really curious just to hear your relationship with painting them, specifically because they feel like these really kind of like quick gestures, but they're also so neat and clear and clean and crisp. So I'm curious how you relate to them and what they feel like to you in the painting process and then also afterwards.
When I was doing my postgrad at Goldsmiths, we had a tutor that told us, you know, the viewer looks at a painting for less than 2 seconds. Any painting, typically. And that really struck me, and I've never forgotten it. And I suppose part of my painting arsenal is to create language that is so seductive, whether that's in color or in drawing the viewer in with impasto or detail. And then once, hopefully, the viewer is engaged, you can start to introduce the more conceptual underpinnings of the work. So I suppose in terms of the backgrounds, actually, you know, it takes the longest time to get that subtle gradation of light. It's so difficult to paint something that's just not there, and to paint it in a certain way that is beguiling and maybe has a warmth to it or a light source somewhere diffused. So that is a deliberate device. With regards to the gesture here in neon, like all aspects of my painting, it's very ambiguous. I think, you know, it could be a celebratory firework, but if you look carefully at the bottom of this painting, there are spent canisters, so there's a sort of implication that perhaps another interpretation could be that it's a distress flare. And we have CQD over here, and there is a painting from a few years ago called SOS, and there is a sense of perhaps, well, both interpretations coexist, but is maybe a sort of oscillation between those two things, and the language is deliberately very slippery.
Can you hear me? I'm not good with these things. I just want to say thank you to Orna and Anj, because you've created an intimate, precious time for all of us. I'm blown away by your willingness to share, your willingness to let us into your process, talk about your paintings, talk about your interpretation, and then allow us to have our own interpretations. Oh my God, I love that. But what I'm really curious about is more of your process. Like, Aileen told me you have 3 little ones, and I wonder how you find the headspace and what it looks like, almost like 24 hours in the life of Anj. Like, do you get to the studio? Is your studio accessible? How do you know when you wake up in the morning, like, today's a day when I want to work on a new painting or an old painting? And I don't know, just a little more of that, if you might be willing to share.
I always joke that when I get fed up with my family, I can take refuge in the studio, and then when I get fed up in the studio, I can take refuge with my family. But, you know, I'm really determined that women that choose to have a family, and of course that's not everyone, there must be a way that that is allowed to happen. And there is a way with support. I'm fortunate enough in this part of my life to be able to outsource a lot of that. So I go to the studio every day, apart from at the weekend. And if I need to finish something, perhaps on Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, I work till 4, but on Saturday morning I'm present for the little ones. It's actually easier than it sounds. I'm very disciplined, and I've had to be, like most artists are actually very disciplined in what we do, and it's quite straightforward. In terms of, there is a moment when I have done all the breakfasts and I arrive in the studio and I'm presented with the void of nothingness. There is a moment there that is a pressure change. But I've found a way around that, and what I do is I have a meditation practice, and it's very simple and straightforward and not especially spiritual. It's just about changing that psychological space, and Orna's been very helpful with this as well, so that I can stop thinking in a shallow register and start to engage with the deeper, more creative processes. So that's really helped me. And I also am one of those people that keeps incessant notes on their phone. So if I have a moment where I'm not able to be in the studio, but I suddenly have a great idea or something that's intriguing and I think it might be the start of some inspiration, then I will just I have all these notes on my phone. So there's ways around all of these things.
And one of the things that you said, you went to the Frick, for example, and when you look at other paintings, how long do you spend looking at those paintings, and what do you find as inspiration for you? Like, are there particular artists that you're especially interested in, and what is it about that has manifested in some amazing work that you've done over the years?
I think there's something really similar, and I can see this with you as well, Orna. I think there's certain people that are just insanely curious about everything the whole time. And I'm sure everyone in this room, if you're here, you're probably in that category. And so I can never tell what is going to appeal in somebody else's work or what I look at. But then I often find just showing up and being open, something really incredible and unexpected happens. It's the unexpected things that I can't anticipate. That's what I find so interesting. And yeah, it satisfies this roving sense of complete curiosity in everything, not just painting.
Something said, I don't know if you know Tommy Ungerer, but he said something that always got me in the past, and that is expect the unexpected. And that's actually what you're saying. Are there particular artists that you especially find inspiring?
I think I find all artists inspiring. I think if you've had the balls to put something out into the world, then make yourself vulnerable in that way, then I think that is fascinating. There's usually something to take away from some evidence of agency that somebody has intentionally put out there.
I just want to thank you both for speaking to how the creative process is actually psychologically nourishing, and maybe just kind of painting a picture of that. But I mainly want to ask about your relationship to style in painting and how you think it could have something to do with the psychoanalytic experience, because there's a lot of moments in the paintings that kind of have this sense of like raw material, but then like a sense of like finesse that happens. So yeah, I'm just wondering how that relates to like style in the paintings.
I think that's a question for you, Orna.
No, but I was just going to say we didn't talk about hair. No, you go.
In terms of how style relates to psychoanalysis, I'd be more interested to hear about how you would think about that. I don't think I pay that much attention to style.
Sorry, I sort of mean like painting style, like yeah, okay. Yes.
Did you mean like
surrealism,
realism?
Yeah, or just like kind of the
like genres,
the like attitude or the kind of paint application. Yeah.
You don't have to answer.
Okay. Sorry, I'm a painter too, so I'm just like speaking in.
Yeah, I mean, I think my main preoccupation is that my paintings don't look like anyone else's. I was told at art school, and it stayed with me, if you're making something that already looks like it might exist in the world, perhaps at an art fair or in a museum or wherever, then maybe you should find different language, because that idea has already got certain currency of its own. So I suppose that's in the forefront of my mind.
There was a question here. Yeah.
Hi, Anj. Congratulations on such a beautiful exhibition. I've always found something very profound in all your paintings about the passing of time, and it was interesting hearing you talk about this idea of like a cataclysm that might have occurred, and we're watching the after effect of that. But I also think that in addition to this kind of theme of perhaps like ruination and erosion, there's also this really profound sense of accretion and addition and adaptability. And you mentioned this great word agency earlier on, and I can't help but think about the way in which Robert Smithson described this idea of ruins in reverse, like this idea of like skyscrapers going up on Park Avenue, and in that midpoint of construction, they feel like ruins before they're completed. And I see something similar with this sort of duality, or sort of a dual nature of like time going forward and backwards in your work. And I wonder if you could speak to this idea of how time is passing in your work. If it's this idea of something being, is it world building, or is it a world that's breaking apart? Is it both at the same time? Just something about,
Thank
the
you
passage
so
of
much
time.
for that question, Abraham. You're always really profound. I think exactly as you said at the end, the wonderful thing that painting can facilitate is it can hold all of those ideas at the same time. And I know I'm a painter, so I'm obviously biased, but I really don't feel as though there's any other media that can talk about the past and could talk about decay, but it can also talk about a present moment and the potential of something happening, and in the same time allude to a future where something has maybe already happened and started to decay again. It's just, painting has this amazing facility, and it articulates things in a very different way to how we are used to experiencing information. I'm very cut and dried. We receive our information we scroll, and it's very shallow and instant and quick. I think painting offers us a pause and a different type of dissemination of these things, but it can be all of those things at the same time, and I find that so seductive. And I wonder if that's why looking at painting can be so consoling, because it kind of addresses all of these things potentially at the same time.
And takes you out of time.
Exactly.
At the same time.
Exactly. Yes. Yeah.
One more. Okay, one more.
Oh, I'm here. Hi. Thanks for this beautiful dialogue. I wanted to ask you about the genesis of your process. Like, You talked about looking at the void, and I wanted to ask actually before that void, dream space, subconscious space, and the tension possibly that you may be carrying, or conflict, or aspects of transformation that are lodged somewhere very far away that you're trying to reach, or if that's part of your language and your process?
I think that's a really interesting question. I'm not sure I would know. Would I know or no?
You're not supposed to know. You're supposed to just be. I think if you, first of all, be warned, pay attention to your dreams tonight, because they're going to be really interesting. Seriously. But if I may say, I mean, if you spend time not only with Anj's paintings, but also talking to Anj, you will feel the thick membrane that often separates us from our unconscious kind of loosen up, and more porousness between like the unformulated, the not yet, and the world of like language uncertainty, which is such a gift. Yeah.
Thank you so much for your engagement with my work. I cannot put into words how much this has meant.